The stalwart's primary capacitor buckled with a screech of tortured metal, throwing Captain Kalen Vorn against the navigation array. A raw, acrid smell, plastic melting under catastrophic energy overload, flooded the cramped bridge, overriding the usual sterile scent of recycled air. Kalen fought for purchase on the deck plating, his lungs seizing momentarily from the sheer physical shock. His reinforced flight suit hissed as the environmental controls struggled to compensate for the localized heat spike. "Status! Thorn! Report!" Kalen roared, pushing himself upright. His voice was rough, scraping against the sudden, violent disruption of the ship's low, constant hum. Rorik Thorn, chief engineer, was already braced against his console, knuckles white against the diagnostics panel. He did not look up. The sound emanating from his position was a wet, strangled grunt, testament to the engineering nightmare unfolding 3 decks below. Section 4 containment breach, Captain. The plasma injector just decided it preferred the structural integrity of the bulkheads to containment. Kalen stared at the main tactical display, the faint, pleading whisper of the distress signal, the anomaly that had lured the stalwart and its collection of desperate scavengers to this forgotten periphery, was lost in the sudden spike of emergency telemetry. This was not the anticipated threat assessment. This was internal decay, the slow, inevitable breakdown of antiquated hardware that Kalen had been fighting to keep operational for 10 rotations. Seal 4. Reroute power from auxiliary environmental regulators to the field stabilizers. I need those stabilizers running at 120%, Kalen ordered, wiping a smear of something viscous, perhaps coolant mixed with lubricant, from his visor. The urgency was not about external enemies. It was about the immediate failure of their flawed vessel. He was responsible for the stalwart, yes, but more crucially, he was responsible for the dozen other patched-up husks currently converging on Eclipse Haven, drawn by the same improbable cry for aid. Rorik punched a sequence of commands with grim precision. "Captain, we starve the habitat modules for 5 minutes to feed the shields. We risk life support failure in the lower decks. We're already running on life support rations that smell like wet concrete and despair." Kalen felt the familiar, hard knot tighten below his sternum. This was the constant arithmetic of command on the fringe, balancing immediate survival against inevitable systemic collapse. He had volunteered for this deep void patrol precisely because the High Command had deemed this sector strategically irrelevant, a cosmic dumping ground where resource wastage was deemed acceptable collateral damage. He knew that the bureaucratic centers back in the core worlds would have decommissioned the stalwart years ago, citing poor performance metrics and excessive maintenance demands. They had left them here to rot, assuming that if they needed saving, they weren't worth the expenditure. "We have already accepted the terms of decay, Rorik. 5 minutes, Kalen confirmed. The air immediately grew colder, the familiar stench of industrial decay replaced by the sharp, metallic tang of starved oxygen scrubbers. The holographic SOS signal flickered back into coherence, momentarily overriding the system alarms. It originated from the Nomara system, deep inside territory the Xylos Empire claimed through sheer, undisputed numerical superiority. The signal was weak, broken by cosmic noise, but undeniably authentic. Human voices, ragged and terrified. Kalen knew the Xylos doctrine. Absolute, emotionless efficiency. They did not engage in petty territorial disputes. They simply absorbed what they deemed logically useful and extinguished what was not. Humanity, with its messy loyalties and unpredictable passions, was definitively the latter. For a colony in Nomara to send a distress call into this void suggested a desperation that transcended standard protocol. It implied that the Xylos were already there, and that their methods were swift and total. "The energy draw from rerouting has stabilized the injectors, Captain," Rorik reported, his breathing heavy. "But the shields are running thin. If anything with kinetic mass larger than a maintenance drone breathes on us, we rupture." Kalen nodded, ignoring the tremor in his left hand, a lingering nerve damage from a campaign 20 years prior. An echo of the day command had ordered a tactical retreat, leaving an entire forward battalion exposed to a Ravthor bombardment to protect a minor logistical hub. That specific failure, the betrayal by his own chain of command, was the fuel that kept him driving the stalwart past its breaking point. He would not abandon a distress call again, especially one that spoke of the same systemic abandonment he had lived through. Bring the habitat power back online. Minimal baseline only. We need the crew alert, not sedated by CO2 levels, Kalen commanded. He turned to the tactical map, zooming in on the Nomara coordinates. The Xylos presence was already calculated as overwhelming. A perfect, crystalline armada arrayed like a shield around the target planet. Captain, the projected travel time to Nomara, even with the jump drive at maximum stress, is 14 standard days. The communications officer, a young man named Ivar Kell, whose eyes were too wide for the reality they were observing, stated formally. If the distress call is current, the colonists will be eradicated long before we arrive. Kalen stared at the map, the cold, hard truth settling over him like atmospheric pressure. He was too far. His barely functioning rust bucket cutter, supported by a small gathering of other derelicts who had answered the phantom call, could not possibly reach the system in time through conventional travel. Kalen, Rorik interjected, finally looking up, his gaze locking onto his captain's. The engineer's eyes held the weary understanding of a man who had seen too many ship cores melt down. The only way to cover that distance in time is a blind jump. Full core overload, minimal navigational lock. We'll skip the fold buffer entirely. A blind jump. It was an act of faith, a technological prayer. The process risked fracturing the very subatomic structure of the ship, scattering the crew across random points in space-time, or worse, rematerializing them inside a stellar body. It was the ultimate rejection of Xylos logic, an embrace of pure, unmitigated chance. Kalen felt the memory of the old betrayal surge, the moment command had chosen cold calculation over human lives. Now, he had to choose the same desperate irrationality to preserve the very people the High Command had forgotten existed. He drew a slow, measured breath, tasting the stale, recycled air, clinging to the memory of the failed capacitor. Rorik, prepare the core for emergency overload sequence. Ivar, plot the trajectory to Nomara. Use the gravitational pull of the system's outermost star cluster as a slingshot vector. We are not taking the safe path. Ivar swallowed hard, the motion visible beneath his tightly fitted collar. Sir, that trajectory, it takes us directly through the Kepler debris field. The gravitational shear alone will tear the smaller vessels apart before we even initiate the jump sequence. Kalen looked out into the star-dusted void, a vast expanse that cared nothing for human suffering or tactical superiority. He was not leading an armada. He was leading a funeral procession, trying to outrun the graveyard marker. Then the smaller vessels will hold position, Ivar, Kalen stated, his voice losing all dryness, taking on a hard, resonant edge. We will breach first. We take the primary kinetic impact. The stalwart will break the current. If they cannot survive the shear, then they are not built for this fight. But if the SOS is real, we are already committed. Rorik, calculate the required containment field divergence to sustain a full jump cycle across 3 seconds of maximum shear stress. Make the calculus work. Rorik looked down at the console, his face a mask of grim calculation. He understood the implication. Kalen was not just preparing the stalwart for a dangerous jump. He was preparing it to sacrifice itself as a kinetic shield for the rest of the motley assembly, ensuring only a fraction of the rescue force would survive the transit, but guaranteeing that someone would reach Nomara before the Xylos silence settled permanently. The weight of that decision, the deliberate sentencing of his own crew to near-certain annihilation for the chance of saving strangers, pressed down on Kalen's chest until his ribs ached. He leaned forward, resting his palms flat on the flickering tactical display, watching the distant, impossible coordinates pulse. The universe demanded cold logic. He would answer with unforgiving, irrational human commitment. The familiar choking scent of ozone and stale air conditioning, a mixture of desperation and failing machinery, settled back over the bridge as the emergency seals clamped down on Section 4. Kalen could feel the hull vibrating at a frequency slightly off the acceptable tolerance, a low, grating sound that grated against his teeth. He forced his gaze away from the tactical readout and down at his own hands, which were clenched so tightly that the seams of his gloves threatened to split. The tremor was still there, not a violent shake, but a persistent internal static that mimicked the failing power conduits below. Rorik, the blind jump, Kalen said, the decision already cemented by the engineering failure that preceded it. Do we have the necessary power reserves, assuming we siphon everything not critical to primary maneuvering thrusters? Rorik looked up then, his face a landscape of soot and fatigue. His eyes, usually fixed on the mathematical certainty of schematics, held a flicker of profound exhaustion. We have enough, Captain. Barely. But the secondary issue isn't power. It's navigation integrity during the shear. Ivar's point stands. The debris field, it's not just random rocks. It's high-density neutronium shards, remnants of the ancient progenitor conflict. They move with too much gravitational pull to be calculated outside a stabilized fold. We jump blind. We will be smeared across the entry vector. Kalen walked toward the viewport, even though there was nothing to see but the velvet blackness punctuated by distant, uncaring stars. The Xylos fleet surrounding Nomara is also moving, Rorik. They are occupying calculated space. That means they are predictable. If we can survive the transit, we arrive with enough momentum to hit them where their logic cannot compensate for brute force. And if we do not survive the transit? Rorik challenged, his voice quiet but cutting. Who saves the colonists then? The High Command? They still think we are running diagnostics on Verlasungdre, Captain. They haven't even registered the energy spike from the capacitor breach. They are content to let the periphery decay. The reminder of Command's indifference struck Kalen like a physical blow. He remembered Karis Vale, his former XO, arguing 2 years prior against the core world's proposed budget cuts to deep void patrols, cuts that resulted in the stalwart operating on hardware older than Ivar Kell. Karis had warned that when the inevitable first contact came, the first line of defense would be composed of scrap metal and sheer stubbornness, not state-of-the-art plasma casters. Karis was gone now, lost during a routine supply run that was deemed non-essential by Central Logistics, left adrift when her support vessel suffered a propulsion failure 10 standard years ago. We survive because we have to, engineer, Kalen snapped, turning back sharply, his tone abandoning all pretense of collegiality for pure command authority. Ivar, contact the remaining vessels, the Iron Lung, the Odyssey's Folly, the rest. Relay the jump parameters. State clearly, the Kepler field will claim any ship lacking the necessary mass-dampening fields to endure high G shear. They are to hold position at Eclipse Haven. We go alone. Ivar paled visibly, gripping the edges of his console. Captain, that leaves the entire rescue contingent stranded 14 days out. If we fail the jump, no one will ever know what happened to Nomara. If we attempt to bring them, we all die prematurely, scattered across interstellar dust, Kalen countered, his gaze hardening. We are the only ship capable of accepting the immediate, violent risk of a blind jump across a gravitational shear field. The rest of the fleet will wait 1 week. If we do not establish a stable beacon from Nomara, they turn back. That is the only ethical distribution of risk I can offer. Relay the order. The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the whine of the restabilized plasma conduits. Ivar, after a visible internal struggle, nodded once, stiffly. As Ivar began broadcasting the grim message, a new alert flashed across Kalen's main screen. An incoming encrypted communication packet, originating from the Kepler field itself, coded in a non-standard, almost archaic encryption signature Kalen had only seen in pre-Federation historical archives. Rorik, what in the void is that signature? Kalen demanded. Rorik magnified the signal analysis, his brow furrowing deeper. It's jamming our jump sequencing calculations, Captain. Not physically. It's inserting corrupted data directly into the trajectory calculation subroutine. Wait. This isn't just random noise. It's highly sophisticated packet manipulation. He typed furiously, his fingers flying over the holographic keys. It's attempting to force a course correction mid-jump initialization. It wants us to deviate from the slingshot vector and enter the field at a lower velocity angle. Who is sending it? Kalen pressed. The Xylos would use brute force jamming. This was too subtle, too manipulative. It felt like a trap set by an intellect that understood human desperation perhaps too well. The source signature is untraceable, Captain. But the insertion vector, it's precise. If we obey that course correction, we avoid the worst of the neutronium shards. We survive the transit intact. Rorik paused, his breath catching. But Captain, following that vector bypasses the gravitational slingshot entirely. It puts us on a direct, slow burn path toward Nomara. It adds 12 days to the travel time. Kalen felt a cold dread wash over him, colder than the loss of environmental regulation hours before. The Xylos were arrogant, but they were predictable in their aggression. This manipulation was insidious. A trap designed not to destroy them outright, but to ensure their inevitable, delayed arrival. Too late for the colonists. They know we're coming, Kalen stated flatly. They allowed the SOS to broadcast, knowing the core worlds would ignore it, but anticipating that someone like us, someone abandoned, would answer. They are waiting for us to arrive slow enough for them to neutralize the remaining colonies safely before we even break atmosphere. The realization was devastating. The Xylos weren't just powerful. They were manipulative manipulators of information and psychology, engineering a scenario where the human instinct to save became the very mechanism of their failure. They understood the human need to avoid immediate sacrifice, the blind jump shear, in favor of delayed success, the calculated entry. If we reject the course correction, we take the shear. We risk total structural failure. But we arrive in time to matter, Kalen murmured, looking from Rorik's anxious face to Ivar, who was now clutching his console, watching the corrupted data stream pulse. We proceed with the initial parameters, Kalen commanded, pushing down the lingering fear of structural collapse. Rorik, initiate a full core purge of all external telemetry inputs immediately prior to jump. We trust nothing that enters this bridge from outside our own compromised systems. Rorik hesitated for only a second, recognizing the finality in Kalen's tone. Purging telemetry now, Captain. Hold tight. This is going to be louder than the capacitor failure. Kalen moved back to the center command seat, strapping himself in with brutal efficiency. He gripped the armrests, the aged metal cold beneath his fingers. The ship began to groan, the sound deepening from a whine to a resonant building chord of impending disaster. The lights dimmed as every available erg of power was forced into the jump drive, plunging the bridge into near darkness, save for the angry red glow of the overload indicators. Ivar, keep the beacon active for 1 full minute after jump initiation. We need to let the others know the gamble started. Then cut the signal. We move silent. The stalwart shuddered violently as the drive began to charge, the raw power of the dying star they were using for their slingshot already tugging at their hull. Kalen closed his eyes, bracing for the shear, for the physical violation of space-time. He knew the odds of surviving the Kepler field were slim, but the certainty of arriving too late if they chose the safe route was absolute damnation. The universe demanded chaos. He leaned into the storm, welcoming the violent uncertainty, ready to sacrifice himself on the razor's edge of time. The charging whine became a tearing sound, not of metal separating, but of reality itself fraying at the edges. A static charge, thick and palpable, crackled across Kalen's exposed neck, plating where his collar seal was beginning to fail. He could smell the sharp, clean scent of burning insulation, mixing with the metallic tang of his own sweat. The physical manifestation of every failing system screaming in unison. He opened his eyes just as Ivar's beacon flared one last time, a desperate, defiant flare against the overwhelming darkness, before being choked off by Rorik's command. The stalwart did not jump. It was flung. The gravitational slingshot, calculated to give them maximum kinetic energy, slammed the cutter into the initial turbulence of the Kepler field. Kalen was instantly pinned to his seat by an impossible force, 1,000 times standard gravity, and the world dissolved into streaks of agonizing light and shadow. The neutronium shards, moving too fast for the eye to track, were not solid impacts, but ripples of sheer gravitational distortion. Each ripple was a full-body blow, rattling the internal organs and threatening to shatter bone. Rorik was screaming something, but the sound was too distorted, too high-pitched, filtered through the catastrophic stress on the comms array. Kalen registered the movement, not by sound, but by sight. Rorik's console sparked violently, spitting a stream of blue-white electrical fire that enveloped the engineer's torso, before the emergency suppression field kicked in with a sputtering hiss. Rorik seized, then slumped, his body slack against the restraints. Kalen wrestled with his own restraints, his vision tunneling to pinpricks of white. The hull integrity monitors were flashing a uniform, impossible crimson. Breach imminent, across 80% of the forward sector. This was not the controlled stress they had braced for. This was annihilation on a molecular level. He focused on the single, stubborn indicator that was holding green. The core containment field, absorbing the kinetic overload, preventing them from simply vaporizing into plasma. He fought the crushing weight, pulling his left arm free, dragging himself toward Rorik's console. The engineer's eyes were open, fixed on a single, stable display, the calculated deceleration point for entry into the Nomara system. Rorik had not stopped working, even while being crushed. He had manually overridden the jump sequence termination parameters, ensuring the drive would bleed off the required momentum across the final meters of space, rather than relying on the automated systems that were currently failing. A final, grim calculation, made while actively dying. Kalen reached Rorik, slapping the engineer's shoulder, a meaningless gesture of acknowledgement. Rorik offered a weak, painful nod before his gaze drifted upward, past Kalen toward the secondary coolant vents above the main viewport. A thin, icy mist was beginning to seep from a hairline fracture in the overhead manifold. The smell of raw, supercooled liquid oxygen, quickly vaporizing in the stressed atmosphere of the bridge. The atmospheric pressure was dropping fast. The air was thinning, becoming painfully cold, sucking the warmth from Kalen's suit, though the bridge temperature was still dangerously high due to the overloaded power conduits. The failure was cascading. The shear had damaged the stabilizers, which then overloaded the atmospheric recyclers, and now the life support was sacrificing itself to maintain the core containment field. This was the cost of defying Xylo's logic, embracing the flaw that brought them here. He needed to seal the coolant leak, or they would lose all breathable atmosphere within minutes. He also needed to stabilize Rorik, whose pulse Kalen could barely detect against his own pounding heart. He pulled his multi-tool from his thigh holster, the metal cold against his gloved hand. He glanced at the main tactical screen. The external camera feed was functional, though heavily distorted by residual electromagnetic interference. They had exited the Kepler field, spitting out of the turbulence near the system's outermost star, and there they were, the Xylo's armada, not arrayed in a perfect defensive ring, but already breaking formation, turning their crystalline prows toward the unexpected intrusion. They detected the jump exit signature, Kalen rasped, the cold air burning his throat. They aren't waiting for a slow approach. They are closing in on the residual energy trace. His choice was immediate and brutal. Rorik needed aid that Kalen could not provide without abandoning the helm. The coolant leak needed immediate manual welding, which required Kalen to expose his arm beyond the suit's primary sealant zone to apply the patch, a move that would likely freeze the limb solid or sever circulation permanently, due to the sub-zero pressure environment now engulfing the bridge. He jammed the multi-tool into Rorik's chest harness, hoping the pressure would stabilize the engineer enough for a moment, then wrenched himself free of the command seat harness. He scrambled along the deck plating toward the vent. The metal was slick with condensation and a thin, rapidly congealing layer of lubricant spray. Kalen positioned himself beneath the leak, his helmet scraping the ceiling. He cycled the external seal on his left gauntlet, the mechanical sigh of depressurization agonizingly loud in the thinning air. The cold hit him like a physical punch. The exposed skin of his hand, protected only by the thin thermal liner of the suit, immediately began to burn with intense cold. He ignored the sensation, reaching up with the welding attachment of the multi-tool. He activated the magnetic clamp, securing the tool near the fracture, then applied the thermal welder. The Xylo's ships were gaining. The tactical map showed their convergence vectors tightening, their energy signatures coalescing into focused firing solutions. He had approximately 90 seconds before the first volley impacted the stalwart's already compromised shields. The weld took agonizingly long. The supercooled oxygen vapor was interfering with the thermal bonding agent. Kalen pushed the welder output to maximum override, a dangerous move that risked overloading the tool's internal battery. Just as the bonding agent finally sealed the crack, a jolt, a minor energy discharge from a distant Xylo's targeting lock, rippled through the stalwart. The surge overloaded the tool. It didn't explode, but the magnetic clamp failed catastrophically, releasing the still molten welding tip directly onto Kalen's exposed wrist. A searing, white-hot agony erupted, a pain so pure and immediate that it erased all thought, all protocol, all tactical awareness. Kalen screamed, a choked, wet sound that was immediately sucked away by the remaining vacuum. He recoiled, crashing backward against the command chair. The molten metal clung to his thermal liner, burning through the protective layers, fusing the damaged metal of the multi-tool to his skin. He grabbed his wrist with his good hand, pulling desperately, but the bond held firm, a cruel anchor linking him to the failed repair. He staggered back to the command seat, dragging the useless, still-burning tool. The atmospheric alarms were now screaming hysterically, the numbers dropping precipitously. He slammed his good hand down onto the ejection release for the attached tool, sacrificing the device entirely. It detached with a sickening wet tear, leaving behind a patch of scorched, bleeding flesh where the liner had been ripped away. He fell into the command chair, gasping, tasting copper and ozone, fighting the overwhelming urge to black out. He slapped the primary control panel, activating the last reserve of power for the jump drive, a desperate, final measure. "Rorik!" Kalen choked out, leaning over the engineer. Rorik was still breathing, shallowly, but the vital signs were fading rapidly. The initial override Rorik performed had stabilized the ship, but the secondary impact from the targeting pulse had clearly knocked him unconscious again, perhaps permanently. Kalen focused on the tactical screen. The Xylos were within firing range. He could see the crystalline geometry of the lead vessel, its energy conduits glowing brighter, charging its main weapon, a massive focused beam designed to pierce deep core shielding. There was no time to plot evasion, no time to coordinate a counterattack. "Ivar, auxiliary power to main thrusters, full burn, vector 037. Kalen barked, forcing his injured arm to remain still. 037 was not an attack vector. It was a direct plunge toward the planetary defense grid of Nomura, a dense field of automated kinetic barriers established by the colonists centuries ago, now likely defunct or bypassed by the Xylos. But Kalen wasn't aiming for the grid. He was aiming for the gap between the grid and the first wave of Xylos destroyers. He didn't need to fight. He needed to create a massive, unavoidable collision course, a chaotic piece of debris for the Xylos to have to navigate around. The stalwart, running on fumes and sheer spite, responded sluggishly, spitting fire from its maneuvering thrusters as it clawed for purchase in space. Kalen watched the Xylos weapon charge, the energy output filling the tactical display like a malignant sun. "Initiating final core discharge," Kalen whispered, his voice barely audible above the frantic atmospheric warnings. He was using the last of the stored energy meant to sustain the life support, the energy Rorik had desperately tried to preserve, to ensure their final, suicidal lunge. The stalwart lurched forward, accelerating into the void between the Xylos formation and the derelict planetary defenses. Kalen's vision swam, the pain in his wrist a constant throbbing reminder of his failure to fully execute the repair. The Xylos' main weapon fired. It was not a single beam, but a focused spear of coherent energy, so brilliant it momentarily overwhelmed the optical sensors. Kalen threw up his good arm to shield his face, bracing for the impact that would turn the stalwart into superheated vapor. The energy spear struck the stalwart dead center. The ship did not vaporize. Instead, the aged, patched-up hull, saturated with the energy bleed from the jump and Rorik's critical override, absorbed the impact in a violent, unnatural manner. The energy did not penetrate, it was redirected. A blinding wave of raw Xylos plasma erupted outward from the stalwart's superstructure, slamming into the three nearest Xylos assault cruisers. Their crystalline hulls, designed for precision absorption, cracked like fractured ice under the sudden, overwhelming blast of their own weapon, magnified and distorted by the human ship's failing systems. The central Xylos formation recoiled, their perfect geometry momentarily shattered by the unexpected blowback. Kalen felt the backlash surge through the bridge, a wave of nauseating, uncontrolled power. The stalwart was no longer flying, it was spinning, dead in the water, its drive core utterly spent, a derelict bomb floating in the kill zone. Kalen looked at the screen. The Xylos were momentarily stunned by the illogical result, but their tactical recovery time was measured in mere seconds. He was floating directly over the planetary defenses, and the residual thrust was pushing him inexorably toward the Nomara surface. Then, a new sensor reading flashed onto the screen, cutting through the static haze, completely independent of the Xylo's targeting activity. It was an energy signature rising from the planet itself. Old, powerful, and utterly alien. Not Xylos, not human. It was a defense system, dormant for centuries, that had just awakened, registering the sudden, massive energy spike of the redirected plasma weapon. And it was locking onto the largest concentration of energy in orbit, the heavily damaged, power-saturated husk of the Stalwart. The human crew had survived the initial weapon blast only to trigger an automated defense system far older and potentially more lethal than the Xylos themselves. The final alarm blared, not red, but a deep, ominous violet. The violet light of the planetary defense system washed over the bridge, bathing Kalen and the slumped form of Rorik in an alien hue that promised annihilation without malice, only automated finality. The air was thin, bitterly cold, and smelled now not of burnt wiring but of deep frozen metal and the sharp, sterile scent of escaping coolant, a smell he associated only with the gravest emergencies, the scent of systems giving up. Kalen forced himself to ignore the screaming environmental warnings and the searing, useless pain radiating from his wrist, which was still uselessly attached to the scorched remains of the multi-tool. The automated system was locking on, calculating trajectory and threat profile based solely on the massive energy signature. The signature the Stalwart had become after absorbing and redirecting the Xylo's plasma. They hadn't just drawn fire, they had become the biggest, brightest target in the system. His gaze snapped to the tactical display, focusing past the Xylo's vessels which were frantically trying to re-establish targeting vectors around the sudden interference. The incoming energy spike from the planet was vast, a focused wave that would vaporize the Stalwart down to its subatomic components in less than 5 seconds. He had bought a reprieve from the Xylos only to face judgment from an ancient, impersonal sentinel. Ivar Kell, miraculously still conscious and seemingly fueled by pure terror, was clinging to his navigation station. His face was ashen, his eyes wide, tracking the incoming threat vector. "Captain, that's a system collapse deterrent, pre-Federation designation. It's programmed to neutralize any uncontrolled energy release in the upper atmosphere. It doesn't care who we are or who fired first." Kalen felt a cold, intellectual clarity settle over the pain. The Xylos believed humanity was chaotic. This ancient defense system confirmed it. Their very survival mechanism, the unpredictable, desperate redirection of energy, was being categorized as an existential contamination. "Rorik's override," Kalen muttered, staring at the inert engineer. Rorik hadn't just stabilized the drive for entry, he had left a massive, residual energy signature purposefully coating the hull, maximizing their visibility for the desperate lunge. Rorik had known the cost. They would either blow up the Xylos or trigger this ancient defense. There was one chance, a route Kalen hadn't considered because it meant abandoning the mission objective, saving the people on the surface. "Ivar, divert all remaining power, what little the drive core yields, to the maneuvering thrusters. Full reverse burn. We need to push away from the planet's gravity well now." "Sir, reverse burn at this mass and proximity will result in catastrophic structural failure. We'll break apart before we clear the initial gravity band," Ivar protested, his voice cracking. "We need to ride this vector in. Maybe we can shield the colony long enough for them to mobilize." Kalen slammed his good fist onto the console, the impact sending a jolt up his arm. "If we ride it in, we detonate directly above them, vaporizing the colony with the resulting shockwave. Ivar, the defense system is locking onto the energy, not the fleet. We must reduce the energy profile immediately." He had to choose between a certain localized death for the Stalwart and its crew, or condemning the colony to face the fully arrayed Xylos force, albeit without the immediate vaporization blast from the automated defense. The calculus was agonizing. Sacrifice the immediate few to give the rest a fighting chance against the known enemy. It was the antithesis of the SOS that had brought them here, the rejection of the very principle that fueled their desperate arrival. Rorik's override must be bleeding power back into the drive core, trying to complete the deceleration. Kalen realized, looking at the engineer with grim admiration. Rorik hadn't just planned a suicide run. He'd planned a slow detonation designed to shield the surface below. Kalen's eyes darted to the auxiliary control panel, noticing a secondary, isolated power conduit that Rorik had manually reinforced during the pre-jump checks, a conduit meant for emergency life support reboot, now the only uncompromised line remaining. Ivar, override the reverse burn command. Plot a collision course with the 3 destroyed Xylos cruisers. Target their primary reactor remnants. Ivar stared, aghast. Captain, we have no propulsion. We'll drift into them. Precisely, Kalen rasped, the cold seeping deeper, making his remaining hand stiff. We cannot fight this energy signature. We must become part of a larger energy signature. If we drift into the debris of the 3 destroyed cruisers, the stalwarts' residual charge, combined with their unstable cores, will create a localized energy pulse far larger than our current profile. The planetary defense system will perceive this as a single massive impact event, not a lingering threat. It will fire its main deterrent, neutralizing the resulting explosion, and us, in one action. It will momentarily blind the Xylos while simultaneously eradicating our energy signature from their tracking. It was a gambit of pure misdirection, to become so much larger and more violent that the automated defense would treat the entire area as a localized catastrophe, requiring immediate total sterilization, a one-time cleansing that would leave the Xylos momentarily confused and vulnerable in the aftermath of the shockwave. He was gambling his remaining crew and the derelict ship on the hope that the Xylos' predictable tactical adherence would cause them to pause and assess the massive, unexpected secondary explosion rather than immediately firing on the surface colony. Kalen reached for the auxiliary conduit release switch, the one intended for Rorik's revival. He knew if he diverted that power, Rorik would die instantly, his final systems failing without the minimal trickle of energy keeping his life signs barely registering. It was the final cold transaction of the mission. He hesitated for a breath, staring at the engineer's face, etched with the grim satisfaction of a problem solved. The image of Karis Vale flashed in his mind, the betrayal that drove him here, and the bitter realization that in this dark corner of the galaxy, survival was always bought with the lives of the near and the near dead. Kalen threw the switch. The effect was immediate and total. The last vestiges of life support immediately terminated. The violet light intensified violently as the stalwart's failing core surged one final time, flooding the ship with power that the hull was never meant to contain. The temperature on the bridge spiked instantly from sub-zero cold to blistering heat, overriding the thermal suits. Kalen screamed as the scorched flesh on his wrist fused violently to the metal of the chair harness. Rorik Thorn went utterly still, his body locking rigid against the restraints as the small life support current was cut. The stalwart, now a hypercharged wreck, drifted perfectly into the grave Rorik had mapped, aligning itself with the shattered remnants of the Xylos cruisers. Kalen didn't see the impact. He was lost in a blinding, deafening confluence of energy signatures, the planetary defense system unleashing its full, ancient fury upon the consolidated energy mass. The shockwave was absolute. A silent, expanding bubble of white-hot annihilation erupted where the 3 cruisers and the stalwart had been. Kalen's consciousness fragmented. The last thing his mind registered, before the crushing dark enveloped him entirely, was the tactical display, now completely blank, utterly free of energy signatures, a void where the stalwart had been. For a moment the Xylos armada hesitated, their sophisticated sensors flooded with chaotic, non-standard energy readings, their immediate tactical threat projection nullified by the sudden, colossal self-destruction. It was the chaos they could not compute. But Kalen's desperate gamble had only bought seconds. A single Xylos vessel, one of the few that had not been within the blast radius, broke formation. It did not fire its main weapon. Instead, it deployed a single, high-velocity microprobe toward the surface of Nomara. The probe was small, designed for surgical infiltration. It bypassed the planet's now quieted defense grid entirely, heading directly for the sector where the original SOS had originated. The Xylos had not retreated. They had simply adjusted their protocol. They had neutralized the external threat, and now they moved to eliminate the source of the contamination. The probe was not a weapon of mass destruction. It was a message, carrying Xylos containment forces directly to the stranded colony. The cleanup had begun. The vacuum was no longer silent. When the searing light of the planetary defense system finally extinguished itself, replaced only by the weak, flickering emergency lighting of the bridge, Kalen was drowning in a sound that was far worse than the previous explosions. It was the omnipresent, low-frequency thrum of a ship dying slowly, not violently. The stalwart was intact. Impossibly so. But it was utterly dead in the water, its core exhausted, its internal systems running on emergency battery backups that were already draining exponentially. He tasted iron, not from blood, but from the extreme atmospheric pressure differential causing capillaries to rupture in his mouth. His good arm felt useless, heavy, as if filled with solidified mercury. He looked at Rorik Thorn. The engineer remained frozen, secured by the safety harness, his final expression a mixture of technical satisfaction and utter defeat. The auxiliary power cut had been clean. Rorik was gone, a final sacrifice purchased with a single desperate switch thrown by Kalen. The knowledge settled like a lead weight in Kalen's gut. He had survived the annihilation wave, but he had done so by murdering the only man who understood how to keep the wreck flying. The tactical display sputtered back to life, displaying a grotesque overview. 3 Xylos cruisers were indeed drifting, their crystalline superstructures scorched and shattered, their energy signatures flatlining. The automated deterrent had successfully purged the immediate area of massive power sources, a localized, temporary tactical victory purchased at the cost of their entire drive system and their chief engineer. But the triumph was a phantom. The single Xylos microprobe, carrying the surgical containment unit, was already halfway through the upper atmosphere. It was silent, small, and utterly focused. The Xylos were not interested in fighting an armada. They were interested in erasing the origin point of the chaos. Ivar Kell, clinging to his navigation station, finally looked away from the threat display, turning his hollow eyes toward Kalen. The young man did not look angry or accusing. He looked broken, aged beyond his years by the rapid-fire sequence of impossible odds. "Captain," Ivar whispered, his voice raspy from the near vacuum exposure. "The thrusters, they are useless. The core is cold. We have perhaps 3 hours of minimal life support before the recycled air reaches critical toxicity levels, even on minimal draw." "We drifted into the debris field, Captain. We achieved the massive energy spike. We bought the colony seconds against the automated defense, but the Xylos saw the anomaly, they adapted, and they sent the precise tool for the job. The microprobe is not a bomb. It's an occupation force." Kalen pushed himself upright, the movement sending agonizing jolts through his spine. His scorched wrist throbbed with a deep, rhythmic beat that felt entirely disconnected from his own pulse. He walked slowly, deliberately, toward the forward viewport, his boots heavy on the deck plating. The weight of command here was suffocating. Not the weight of strategy, but the sheer, crushing burden of failed logistics. They had arrived too late, and in their desperation, they had only served to show the enemy exactly where the true weak point lay. He stared at Nomara. It was a pale blue marble, scarred by orbital defense rings that were now inert, silent monuments to a past war. He had saved the stalwart from the initial blast, but only by turning it into a sacrificial beacon that inadvertently highlighted the colony for the Xylos' precise cleanup operation. "They knew," Kalen said, the words emerging from his chest, not his throat, heavy with the realization that had been building since the blind jump. The Xylos knew the High Command wouldn't answer. They allowed the signal to propagate, knowing that the only ones desperate enough to respond would be those who had already been discarded. They used our own abandonment against us. We were not the cavalry, Ivar. We were the bait for the colony's last hope. The philosophical victory, the proof that human tenacity could disrupt Xylos logic, was now reduced to this: a single, small probe descending toward the surviving populace. The colony was still alive, but they were facing an enemy that had just learned precisely how to circumvent the very chaos that saved them moments ago. Kalen turned from the view, his eyes settling on Rorik's still form. He had made 2 catastrophic decisions in rapid succession, both rooted in the flawed premise that chaos could always outmaneuver flawless calculation. First, the blind jump which nearly destroyed them. Second, the calculated sacrifice to trigger the planetary defense, which only provided the distraction the Xylos needed. The tactical assessment is complete, Captain, Ivar stated, his voice flat, devoid of hope. We have no propulsion, no defenses, failing atmosphere. We have become ballast. We cannot reach the surface, and the Xylos probe will neutralize all internal resistance within the hour, based on its vector. Kalen walked to the engineering station, his gaze falling on the main diagnostic readout. Beneath the critical failures, one small subroutine was flickering. An experimental long-range communication array Rorik had secretly been installing, designed to punch through deep sector jamming using residual warp field echoes. It was low power, highly directional, and required an immediate, massive energy spike to initiate a signal burst strong enough to reach the nearest Federation relay, a relay that was likely years away on standard travel time. The array, Ivar. Rorik installed it, Kalen said, pointing to the faint indicator. If we can bypass the environmental safety locks and channel the remaining emergency battery power directly into that array, we can send one final message. A full tactical debrief, the Xylos deception, the probe deployment. We can warn the core worlds precisely how the Xylos are operating in the periphery. Ivar followed his gaze, the implication dawning on him. Captain, that surge will drain the last reserves powering the air scrubbers and heating elements. We will have perhaps 30 minutes of stable atmosphere, maximum, before the toxins overwhelm us. And if the array fails to punch through the residual energy field from the defense blast, we've just traded 30 minutes of toxic air for absolutely nothing. Kalen looked down at his fused wrist, the physical pain a grounding anchor in the chaos. He thought of Karis Vale, left to drift because command deemed her mission non-essential. He thought of the colonists, who answered the SOS because they believed they were not alone. His entire motivation for the last 3 days had been the preservation of these lost souls, yet his actions had directly led to their final exposure. He had failed the tactical objective. He had failed the men who followed him, Ivar, and the ghost of Rorik. Heroism was out of the question. He was too late for that. But failure, in this cold sector of space, did not have to mean silence. We are already dead in the water, Ivar, Kalen said, his voice calm, almost meditative, the strange quiet of absolute exhaustion setting in. The toxin levels will rise regardless. But if we die here, if the stalwart simply fades into atmospheric decay, the Xylos win twice. They eliminate the immediate threat, and they proceed with their slow, silent purge of Nomara, unopposed, without consequence being documented. He moved toward the power conduit, his movements stiff and agonizingly slow. He ignored the pain radiating from his wrist. We send the report. We document their strategy. We prove that their cold, flawless logic is now incorporating psychological warfare against the marginalized. That report, Ivar, is the only weapon left to us. We ensure that when the next fringe colony sends an SOS, the core worlds understand exactly the kind of trap they are walking into. Kalen reached the auxiliary panel, his good hand hovering over the bypass switch for the environmental locks. The final violation of every protocol drilled into him since his academy days. He was consciously condemning himself and Ivar to a quick, choking end. Not to save the colony, but to save the information about the colony's destruction. It was a bleak administrative form of vengeance. Prepare the burst sequence, Ivar. Target the nearest confirmed Federation data buoy, regardless of travel time. Set the priority level to absolute critical. Betrayal Protocol Alpha. Ivar nodded, a single jerky motion. He began keying in the commands, his breath hitching sharply as the atmosphere visibly began to thin further, the air tasting thick and acidic. Kalen threw the switch. The last functional systems on the stalwart roared one final time. Not with propulsion, but with pure, raw transmission energy. The bridge lights flared brilliant white, momentarily blinding them both, before plunging into absolute blackness as the emergency power banks were completely depleted in the single desperate burst toward the distant Federation relays. Then, only the ragged, gasping sound of Ivar Kell's final breaths remained in the suffocating dark, a sound that echoed the terrifying, lonely sound of a fragile human plea hurled into an uncaring galaxy. The message was sent, the cost was paid, and the silence returned. This time, absolute, heavy, and final. Bevor wir weitermachen, eine kurze Frage. Von wo aus siehst du dir diese Geschichte an? Der Kommandant wäre begeistert zu erfahren, wie weit unsere Flotte bereits vorgedrungen ist. The switch engaged with a violent internal clack that sounded like a bone snapping deep within the hull. The emergency battery cells, designed for minor diagnostic polling, screamed as the entire residual charge surged into the repurposed array Rorik had hidden. Kalen felt the deck shudder violently under a wave of electrical feedback that smelled sharply of superheated metal dust and ozone. The lights, which had been flickering weakly, exploded outward in momentary arcs of blinding white light, instantly incinerating the dust motes suspended in the rapidly thinning air. The Xylos microprobe, visible now as a pinprick of deliberate motion against the marbled blue of Nomara, seemed to hesitate for a microsecond, its internal sensors momentarily overwhelmed by the unexpected energy spike originating from the dead patrol cutter. That hesitation, that single moment where flawless logic encountered a defiant, fatalistic spasm of human will, was all Kalen had gambled on. Ivar gasped, a wet, ragged sound swallowed instantly by the deepening void of breathable air. He slumped forward, the impact of his head against the console sounding dull and final. Kalen could not spare the energy to check him, the cold reality of the engineer's decision pressing down on him. The transmission had priority over even the primary air filtration regulators. Kalen moved toward the engineering conduit, dragging his heavy frame across the metal floor, shards of plastic paneling crunching under his boots. The primary hazard now was not the probe, but the sheer inertia of the stalwart's failing life support. The internal temperature began to drop precipitously, the emergency heating coils dying without core power. The air tasted brittle, scraping against Kalen's throat with every desperate inhalation. He reached the manual override junction for the magnetic docking clamps, the last functioning external system, still locked onto the debris field from the catastrophic jump. He had to jettison the dead mass of the cutter to prevent the probe from simply crushing the wreck and everyone within it when it completed its gravitational correction. His fused wrist screamed as he grabbed the emergency release lever, a crude mechanical fallback designed for pre-warp vessels. He braced his entire body weight against the lever, pulling down with the savage focus of a starving predator. For several strained seconds, nothing happened. The clamps were seized by the sheer magnetic residue of the debris field. Kalen closed his eyes, ignoring the stinging dryness threatening to crack his corneas. He visualized the junction box, not as a diagram, but as Rorik had described it a year prior during a mandatory system integrity check. If the hydraulics seize, Captain, the primary magnetic coupling has a manual shear pin. It's a physical release, designed to be hammered free. A single, hard blow, delivered precisely where the flux cable meets the housing. He released the lever, stepped back 3 paces, and brought his functional boot down in a sharp, downward arc directly onto the access panel covering the flux cable housing. The blow was intended to be precise, but the impact sent a fresh wave of blinding agony up his leg. He fell, catching himself on the edge of the dead engineer's console. A deafening crack resonated through the bridge, the sound of sheared metal giving way to brute force. The magnetic clamps disengaged. The stalwart, a dead metal husk of defiant failure, began to drift slowly away from the Kepler debris field, propelled only by the slight, lingering momentum of the blind jump. It was now completely adrift, a ghost ship sinking into the darkness between systems. Kalen crawled back toward the main display, pulling himself up on a support strut. The toxic haze on the bridge was growing thicker, visible now in the faint, sputtering emergency lights. A gray-brown miasma that promised a slow, agonizing neurological shutdown. He forced his eyes onto the tactical display. The Xylos microprobe was no longer visible. It had passed beneath the local sensor horizon, committed to its terminal vector toward the colony's core population center. But the initial energy burst had done its work. The Xylos cruisers, still damaged but now regaining minimal sublight maneuvering capability, were slowly turning. They were not pursuing the probe. They were repositioning to contain the area of the energy anomaly, Kalen's drifting wreck. "Ivar," Kalen croaked, his voice a pathetic rasp. He received no response. The young officer was still slumped over the console. His breathing ceased entirely. The silence was now layered. The dying thrum of the ship, the heavy stillness of the dead man, and Kalen's own desperate struggle for air. The stalwart was now a floating tomb, but it was moving away from Nomara. The Xylos would scan the dead colony, find only the remnants of a resistance they had already neutralized, and then sweep the periphery for the source of the disruptive energy. They would find the derelict cruiser. Kalen knew the Xylos protocols regarding captured or derelict enemy technology. They would not engage with a dead hulk immediately. They would dispatch automated salvage drones to board, analyze the core failure signatures, and, if they found evidence of the transmission array's activation, they would systematically wipe the databanks before recovering the wreck for study. The final debriefing, the warning he had paid for with 3 lives and his own, was in mortal danger of being erased before it could propagate. He had mere minutes before the first Xylos boarding drones arrived. He needed to ensure the array's data packet was not just sent, but confirmed as delivered, regardless of the remaining power. He staggered toward the communications bay, moving through corridors where sparks occasionally spat from exposed wiring, the only light source in the deepening gloom. The internal atmospheric pressure alarms had gone silent. The system had finally failed to register the near-vacuum conditions, or perhaps the sensor array itself had overloaded. The comms bay was colder still. Kalen located the residual energy signature of the array Rorik had installed. It was a small auxiliary panel, barely functional. He bypassed the redundant safeties, the ones designed to prevent feedback into the main power grid, and found the input terminals. He didn't need full power. He needed a directional pulse of any energy remaining to force the confirmation handshake with the distant buoy. He found a heavy wrench, intended for emergency hull breaches, and brought it down with grim accuracy onto the nearest functioning power conduit leading to the panel, bypassing all regulation. The result was instantaneous and brutal. A sheet of violet electrical discharge erupted from the panel, enveloping Kalen's hands and climbing his scorched arm. The pain was absolute, searing through bone and nerve, overriding the chemical dullness of the failing oxygen. For a terrifying eternity, Kalen was nothing more than a conductor, a conduit for raw, desperate energy. His body locked rigid, every muscle fiber screaming in protest against the current flowing through him. He stared fixedly at the small confirmation screen attached to the array. The data packet, the narrative of their suicidal defiance, was in transit. He saw the progress bar crawl. 5%, 10%, 15%. The Xylos were close. He could see the faint metallic signatures of their scout drones approaching on the external proximity sensors, which were running on independent, minimal battery backups. They would be boarding in under 3 minutes. At 55% completion, the current peaked. Kalen's vision tunneled into a single burning point of light. He felt the terrifying sensation of his internal systems overloading, not from external trauma, but from conducting too much electricity. He heard a sound, not an explosion, but a loud pop, originating from within his own chest cavity, like a small pressurized canister rupturing. Then, the confirmation flash. A single, brilliant green icon illuminated the screen. Delivery confirmed. Handshake established. The power died instantly. Not slowly, but utterly, cutting off the electrical torture. Kalen collapsed onto the deck, a useless heap of ruined flesh and scorched polymer, his good arm twitching weakly. The air was now almost completely unbreathable, thick with corrosive gases and the heavy, inert nature of true vacuum infiltration. He lay there for a long time, listening to the nothingness that followed the electrical death. The silence of the stalwart was now complete. When Kalen finally forced his eyes open, the proximity alarms, running on their independent, near-dead batteries, began a low, stuttering warning beep. The Xylos drones were latching onto the hull. He could hear the faint, grating sound of automated plasma cutters beginning their work on the external plating near the engineering section. They were methodically peeling back the stalwart's skin to find the source of the anomaly. He was alone, dying slowly in the dark, aboard a ship that no longer existed as a functional entity. He had sent the message. He had documented the Xylos' strategy of exploiting the forgotten fringes. The final, cynical act of human defiance was complete. Kalen tried to shift, to find a better position, but his limbs refused the command. He stared upward into the blackness where the bridge ceiling used to be, seeing nothing but the endless, indifferent stars wheeling by. The stalwart was now a target, a piece of debris about to be catalogued and dissected by an enemy who valued data above all else. He had traded the chance of survival for a piece of verifiable information. It was the most purely logical, brutally necessary action he had ever taken, disguised as ultimate irrationality. He had ensured that the death of a few forgotten souls would not be a silent footnote in an uncaring galactic history. The great cold machine of the Xylos Empire had been shown a flaw in its design, a vulnerability rooted in its arrogance towards the marginalized. And now, Kalen could only wait for the drone swarm to find him and erase the evidence physically, leaving only the coded echo of his failure traveling across the void. The grating sounds ceased, not abruptly, but with a slow, calculated cessation, as the automated cutting tools completed their mandated sweep pattern. The Xylos had secured the breach points, the heavy, thudding impacts that had characterized their preliminary boarding. The mechanical boots of the analysis units never arrived on the bridge deck. They knew. They had already found Rorik's severed power relays, the burned-out comms nexus, and the final, conclusive evidence of Kalen's self-immolation at the transmission console. The mission was analyzed, catalogued, and sealed. The anomaly had been neutralized. Kalen remained fixed to the deck plating, conscious only through the agonizing slowness of his dying biological processes. The cold had seeped past his scorched flight suit, chilling him to the marrow. His breath was shallow, a wet rasp against the near-vacuum atmosphere. He did not feel pain anymore. Only a vast, profound emptiness where sensation used to reside. He was a data point recording its own destruction. He did not look toward the body of Ivar Kell, now a dark, stiff silhouette against the faint green flicker of the residual life support displays that were drawing their last molecules of power from nowhere. Kalen could only focus on the viewport, the crystalline expanse of dead light years that had seemed so full of opportunity only 14 days prior. Now, they were just the backdrop for a derelict vessel. The stalwart was no longer groaning, it was simply present. A static object caught in the gravitational tide of the distant Xylos fleet, establishing its permanent zone of influence around the ravaged Nomara system. The rescue ships, those handful of desperate patched-together cutters that had followed the original distress beacon, were still scattered across the fringe, waiting for confirmation. They would receive nothing now but silence, or perhaps, eventually, the same coded warning Kalen had risked everything to send. But silence, Kalen understood, was the primary tool of Empire. A silent victory was always a complete one. He closed his eyes against the indifferent starlight. The memory of the core world mandate flashed, clear and sharp, despite the chemical fog dulling his mind. Sector 3. Delta is strategically irrelevant. Resources expended will not be justified. They had discarded them, left them to rust, and now, Kalen had died confirming that the cost of ignoring the periphery was the introduction of a calculated, painful variable into the Xylos expansion matrix. It was not a victory. Victory implied a reversal of terms. This was merely a documented liability. The weight of the failure, the knowledge that the thousands on Nomara were likely already processed into biological slurry or raw material, pressed down harder than the failing atmospheric pressure. He had arrived too late, even by gambling on technological suicide. The system of command, flawed by bureaucracy and distance, had been replicated in the timing of his desperation. The flaw was systemic, not localized. Humanity, as always, carried the seed of its own strategic defeat within its necessary, messy organization. Kalen felt a tremor run through the deck. Not an engine tremor, but the subtle vibration of heavy magnetic grapples engaging the hull. The Xylos salvage teams were here. They would not be brutal. Brutality was wasteful. They would be efficient. They would strip the stalwart down to its base atomic components, analyzing the core breach, cross-referencing the energy signature of the transmission burst, and identifying every tactical vulnerability utilized by the deceased crew. They would learn from Kalen's final, irrational choice, integrate it, and refine their methods for the next forgotten world. He managed to move his head slightly, enough to catch the reflection of his own visor in the darkened tactical display. The glass was cracked across the center, a thin, spiderweb fracture running through the reflected image. It was not the same damage as before, but the visual echo was undeniable. The fractured lens, the broken connection to the immediate reality. He recalled the initial, sharp scent of plastic melting under catastrophic overload, The desperate, violent struggle to keep the ship alive just long enough to hear the call. Now, the air was thick, inert, and cold. The crisis had passed into inventory. Kalen's fingers twitched one last time, brushing against a piece of hardened polymer shard embedded near his wrist. It was a piece of the main console housing, broken off when he first slammed against it in the initial shock. It was sharp, rough, and entirely meaningless, a fragment of junk metal that had survived the surge longer than the primary systems. He drew a final, painful, toxic gasp into his lungs, tasting the corrosive air of absolute failure and absolute commitment. The harsh, unforgiving void was finally closing in, demanding its payment for the disruption. The universe is vast, and it rewards calculation over passion. Yet passion, when applied with sufficient force to the breaking point, can still leave a scar on the equation. The stars looked very far away. The hull sighed as the Xylo's containment field locked onto the stalwart's mass, preparing the slow disassembly. The plastic fragment felt cold against his skin. And there was nothing left to fight for, only the residue of the fight itself. Wenn dir diese Mission gefallen hat, schließe dich unserer Crew an. Abonniere den Kanal und teile diese Episode mit jemandem, der Science Fiction liebt. Jedes neue Crewmitglied stärkt unsere Flotte und hält diese Geschichten im ganzen Universum lebendig.